This week's flag is the UK. The UK has not covered itself in glory over the last few weeks from an environmental point of view. Our government has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2050. That is to say that we won't be emitting any CO2. All the CO2 we emit will be able to absorb in some other ways. Those promises have taken a massive blow to the head over the last few days. The biggest one being that the government decided to give a green light to the opening of a new oil drilling site around the Shetland Island, offshore oil drilling in North Sea. It's going to become the biggest oil field the UK currently has open once it opens. Obviously all that oil will be burnt to release some CO2. So it kind of raises some big questions as to what we do from a carbon neutrality point of view. And the big question really is that the UK claims to be cutting down its emissions the most, and that is true, but only to some extent. What we are doing really well at is cutting our own CO2 emissions within the UK, but our calculations in the UK aren't including any CO2 emitted by other people on the UK's behalf. So for instance, if there's a factory that produces food and clothes out in another country and we import those clothes, those CO2 emissions won't be counted in our budget, despite the fact that it is because of us they've had to emit that CO2. And the same goes to the oil sites in the Shetland. Arguably that oil will be produced by us, but it won't be burnt by us, so arguably it won't count in the UK's CO2 footprint, which is kind of a travesty because we were the ones providing that oil for other people. So that kind of was the first negative news that we saw from the UK's environmental pledge. Another negative impact we saw was, or big news story, was one of the landmark infrastructure projects of our government to reduce CO2 emissions, to move towards a carbon neutral transport grid, and to shrink the north-south divide. Year 11s have been learning all about it. It's called HS2, high-speed rail to connect to London, to Manchester and Leeds. A few years ago, that multi-billion pound budget and project was scrapped at one leg of it, so that project's not going to go to Leeds anymore. It's just going to go to Manchester. And this week there's been some huge questions as to whether it'll even get to Manchester, and the government has refused to acknowledge whether it will scrap the line or not. As it stands, it's going to go to Birmingham, but there's a big question as to whether it'll go further, and if it doesn't go further, there's a real question as to what difference that'll make to the north-south divide, and also what difference that'll make to our carbon footprint of transport, because it was supposed to be an electric train. And then the final one, nothing to do with politics, but to do with illegal logging. There was a national monument landmark tree, 200-year-old tree called the sycamore tree in the Sycamore Gap on the Hadrian's Wall in the northeast of England that was illegally felled overnight. 2 arrests have been made, but it kind of highlights how little care we have to the local environment. This tree had provided an ecosystem and a habitat. It was a way of storing carbon, and cutting 200-year-old history and carbon storage is exactly the kind of things we need to be avoiding. We need to avoid doing in a sustainable future. So yeah, not great news from an environmental point of view if you live in the UK or if you kind of related to the UK in any way.